The sun over eastern Texas hung low that evening in June 1993, stretching long orange reflections across the quiet streets of Pinefield, a town where time seemed to move slower than anywhere else. Porch lights flickered on one by one as families settled in after supper, unaware that their peaceful summer night would soon become a memory they would speak of for decades to come. At the center of that town lived Samantha Tully, a 25-year-old teacher whose presence seemed to brighten every space she entered. Her students adored her calm patience, her gentle laugh, and the way she used stories to make history come alive. Born and raised in Pinefield, she had returned home after college in Austin to teach at the same elementary school she'd once attended. That Friday evening, Samantha had stayed a little later than usual at school, helping decorate her classroom for the end-of-year celebration. Her co-teacher, Linda Perez, recalled watching her gather colored ribbons and chalk, smiling as she worked. She said she wanted her students to remember that learning could feel like summer, Linda would later say softly. When Samantha didn't arrive home by 8, her neighbor, Pauline Grant, noticed. It wasn't like her to miss her evening walk or forget to feed her cat, Whiskers. Pauline called her house phone several times but got no answer. At first, she thought maybe Samantha had gone out with friends, but as the hours passed and her porch light remained on, Pauline felt an unease she couldn't shake. By midnight, the local sheriff's office received a call. Deputy Evan Cole arrived at the small white house on Cedar Street, greeted by Pauline waiting nervously on the porch. The front door was unlocked, the lights inside still on. On the kitchen counter, there was a cup of tea, still warm, and Samantha's car keys rested beside it. The next morning, search teams gathered around town. Friends, family, and students joined in, walking through nearby parks and fields. Flyers were posted across telephone poles, each one bearing Samantha's smiling face. The community came together in a way only small towns do. Church members brought sandwiches and coffee for volunteers. Children drew signs saying, "Come home soon, Miss Tully." Every road, trail, and creek bed within 10 miles was checked, yet there were no clear clues. Weeks passed, and though people remained hopeful, the search began to slow. Pinefield, once lively with cheerful chatter, grew quiet. Teachers continued to keep Samantha's desk untouched, with her favorite books stacked neatly beside her framed photo. Detective Marvin Rhodes, then a seasoned investigator with the Pine County Sheriff's Department, was assigned to the case. He had handled missing persons before, but this one struck him differently. He met with Samantha's parents, Arthur and Helen Tully, at their farmhouse on the edge of town. Helen held a small notebook Samantha used to keep lesson ideas in, its pages now worn from being read so many times. "She loved her students more than anything," Helen said softly. "She wouldn't just leave them." Marvin promised them he would not stop searching. He reviewed every witness statement, every piece of evidence, every sighting report. A few residents remembered seeing a light blue pickup truck parked near the school that evening. Another mentioned a man who often stopped by to sell fruit from his roadside stand, but nothing directly linked to Samantha's disappearance. By autumn 1993, the case had become one of quiet persistence. Investigators continued to follow small leads, but they faded as quickly as they appeared. Pinefield slowly adjusted to life with a shadow of uncertainty that lingered over it. In the years that followed, Samantha's name remained in town conversations. Her students grew up, some becoming teachers themselves, carrying her memory forward. Every June, the school held a small remembrance garden event in her honor, a way to keep her kindness and warmth alive through time. But for her parents, the wait was endless. Arthur spent long evenings on the porch, watching the fading horizon, while Helen kept fresh flowers in Samantha's old room. The house stayed exactly as it had been, the books on the shelves, the quilt folded at the foot of her bed, the soft scent of lavender still faint in the air. Through the 1990s and early 2000s, technology changed rapidly, but the case remained in storage, the files sitting neatly inside a labeled box marked Tully, Missing Person, 1993. It wasn't until 2014 that a new investigator, Detective Riley Hammond, reviewing unsolved cases for the Pine County Cold Case Unit, came across Samantha's file. She was known for her methodical approach, someone who read every detail slowly, looking for patterns others might miss. When she saw the original evidence list, she noticed something interesting. A piece of fabric collected near the wooded trail behind the school had never been fully tested for DNA. At the time, forensic tools couldn't analyze such a small, degraded sample, but now, new technology could. Riley signed the request for retesting that same week. The sample was sent to the Texas Department of Public Safety Laboratory in Austin, where advanced sequencing was performed using trace extraction methods. It took nearly 3 months for the report to return. When it did, it contained a partial DNA profile, enough to confirm that the fabric had belonged to Samantha's blouse. More importantly, it carried another unidentified profile, one that didn't match anyone from the original investigation. Riley's heart quickened. She checked the database and found no immediate match, but she didn't stop there. Using the new forensic genealogy program recently available in Texas, she requested the profile be uploaded for extended familial comparison. Weeks later, an alert came through, a partial familial match to an individual living in eastern Oklahoma. The connection was distant, a second cousin, but it was enough to build a family tree that eventually pointed to a man named Warren Clay, who had once worked seasonal maintenance at a property near Pinefield in the early 1990s. Riley's next step was careful. She began reviewing employment records, vehicle registrations, and any connections Warren might have had to the area. She found that he had indeed been in Pinefield in June 1993, working for a small landscaping company contracted to service the school grounds. Her pulse steadied as she wrote down the dates. Everything aligned perfectly with Samantha's disappearance. But rather than rush to conclusions, Riley wanted confirmation. She requested a new search warrant for the original evidence box to see if anything might still hold usable DNA traces. Inside, she discovered an old hairbrush, preserved carefully by the previous detectives. When tested again under modern methods, it yielded a pristine sample of Samantha's DNA, enough for cross-analysis with the suspect's potential profile. The lab requested a sample from Warren Clay for comparison. Local authorities in Oklahoma cooperated willingly, collecting it under standard procedures. When the results came back, the DNA was a direct match. Riley sat at her desk for several moments before calling her supervisor. It wasn't just about science. It was about a promise kept, decades later, to a family who had never stopped waiting. The sheriff called a meeting that afternoon. The entire department gathered quietly around as Riley explained her findings. There was a hush when she finished, followed by a wave of calm relief. Plans were made for immediate coordination with Oklahoma officials to bring Warren in for questioning. The Pine County Sheriff's Department, in partnership with state authorities, wanted every step documented carefully and respectfully. When news of the reopening reached Pinefield, people responded with quiet reflection. Some of Samantha's former students, now adults, left flowers near the school sign. Others wrote messages online about how her kindness had shaped their childhood. The day of the arrest arrived in the fall of 2015. Warren Clay, now in his early 50s, was cooperative when approached. He had lived a simple, quiet life in a rural area outside Tulsa. As detectives explained why they had come, he listened calmly. He did not argue or resist. Riley stood nearby as he was informed of the investigation's purpose. It wasn't triumph she felt, but stillness, a feeling that years of waiting had gently begun to lift. Back in Pinefield, Arthur and Helen Tully received a call from the sheriff's office. When they heard the words, they didn't speak right away. Helen simply closed her eyes and whispered, "Thank you." The arrest wasn't the end. It was the beginning of the final chapter, a slow, careful process to ensure that every truth would be treated with the dignity Samantha's memory deserved. That evening, the sun once again lowered over Pinefield, bathing the old schoolyard in golden light. The air felt peaceful. For the first time in more than 20 years, the Tully family could breathe freely, knowing the promise of answers was finally being fulfilled. When the search stretched into the first week, the sun-bleached posters of Sabrina Miles hung on telephone poles across the dusty backroads of western Texas. Her parents, Harold and Diane Miles, refused to take them down, convinced that every new day would bring an answer. Reporters from nearby towns began arriving with heavy cameras and hot microphones, filming long shots of Sabrina's house, a one-story home framed by pecan trees. Inside, silence pressed against the walls. Diane stopped cooking breakfast because each frying sound reminded her of Sabrina's laughter. Harold began driving his truck alone through the same highway where his daughter was last seen, scanning every ditch and mile marker, convinced he had missed something. The local sheriff's office had little to go on. Sheriff Clyde Whitaker, a man who had served nearly 3 decades in law enforcement, gathered his small team in the briefing room. The evidence table looked almost empty. Sabrina's torn grocery receipt, one strand of hair found near a gravel turnout, and an unverified sighting from a gas station attendant who claimed he saw her talking to someone in a blue pickup. Without leads, the investigation depended on persistence. Deputies followed tire marks, interviewed ranchers, and inspected abandoned barns. But days turned into months, and the open fields yielded no sign of her. By late summer, the case quietly shifted from missing person to possible foul play. The sheriff avoided using the word crime, yet the hush in his voice during the family meetings said everything. The community of Marston County had always been close-knit. Neighbors left casseroles on the Miles family's porch, pastors prayed for Sabrina during Sunday services, and children's drawings of her were taped inside the post office window. But as the years went on, hope softened into a dull ache. People married, moved, and raised families. Yet the sight of the old flyer, Sabrina's smiling portrait, still carried a weight of memory. In 1997, a new detective joined the sheriff's department, Detective Lyle Hernandez, then only 28, eager and idealistic. He read Sabrina's case file late at night and asked permission to re-examine the physical evidence. Sheriff Whitaker, nearing retirement, agreed. Lyle requested the small box from the evidence room, a cardboard container marked Miles, as he laid out its contents on a wooden table. The receipt, the hair sample, a faded Polaroid of Sabrina's car, and photos from the original search. He noted that the strand of hair had never undergone full DNA testing, mainly because the technology available in the early 90s couldn't produce reliable results. By 1999, basic DNA comparison had become more advanced, but the sample was too small for analysis. Lyle sent it to the state lab anyway, hopping for anything. Weeks later, the lab report came back, insufficient material for testing. He felt the disappointment like a physical weight. Still, he refused to close the file. Over the next decade, each new scientific method brought a flicker of possibility. But funding was limited, and Sabrina's case was one among hundreds statewide. The family never gave up. Diane wrote letters every year to the governor's office, pleading for cold case funding. Harold, older and slower now, carried a photo of his daughter in his wallet wherever he went. On her birthdays, they lit a single candle by the front window and watched its glow fade through the glass. Then, in 2006, a statewide initiative encouraged local agencies to review cold cases using updated DNA procedures. Detective Hernandez, now a seasoned investigator, immediately pulled Sabrina's file from the archives. The hair strand had been preserved properly, so he submitted it again for enhanced mitochondrial testing. Months passed. When the results finally arrived in early 2007, the lab confirmed that the DNA did not match any family members, meaning the sample likely belonged to the person who had been with Sabrina the day she disappeared. That single piece of information reignited the investigation. Hernandez contacted every person listed in the original witness log. Many had moved or changed numbers, but one woman, Rita Vaughn, still lived nearby. She was the gas station attendant who'd reported seeing Sabrina all those years ago. Rita remembered a small detail that had been overlooked. The man driving the blue pickup had a sticker on the rear bumper, something circular with a white border. She thought it might have been a construction company logo. That clue, faint but valuable, led investigators to re-examine old employment rosters from construction firms active in Marston County in 1993. After weeks of searching, one name surfaced: Alan Kersey, a worker who had briefly been assigned to a job near Sabrina's route. He had since moved to New Mexico and had no record of violence or crime. Still, the timing and vehicle description matched. Hernandez reached out to the New Mexico authorities for assistance. When they located Kersey, he appeared cooperative and allowed a DNA sample to be taken voluntarily. The results took months, but when the report returned in mid-2008, it ruled him out completely. Another lead gone. For the next several years, Sabrina's file sat in the department's pending cabinet again. Detective Hernandez transferred to a regional task force but carried a copy of her photo in his notebook. Something about her case never let him go. Then came 2012, a year that quietly changed everything. The Texas Department of Public Safety launched a forensic backlog project that retested thousands of unidentified DNA samples with next-generation sequencing technology. One of those samples came from Sabrina's case. In March 2013, a technician in Austin noticed a partial match in the system, not a direct hit, but a familial link to a DNA profile already stored in the national database. The connection led to a man serving a short sentence for an unrelated property crime in Louisiana. His name, Calvin Royce. Detective Hernandez drove to Baton Rouge to interview him. Royce was soft-spoken, almost detached, and denied knowing anyone named Sabrina Miles. But when Hernandez asked where he had been living in 1993, Royce hesitated. He finally admitted he had been working temporary construction jobs in West Texas that year, specifically near Marston County. Hernandez left the prison with a slow-growing certainty that the decades-old mystery might finally be nearing its end. He requested a full DNA comparison between Royce's genetic profile and the strand recovered from Sabrina's case file. In early 2014, the results came back, match confirmed. The report was only 3 pages long, but its words carried nearly 21 years of waiting. When the sheriff's office received confirmation, the air in the building felt different, quiet, tense, and almost reverent. Officers who had been in school when Sabrina vanished gathered around Hernandez's desk as he read the document aloud. He sat back in his chair, took a deep breath and whispered, "We finally have her answer." The Miles family was notified that evening. Diane wept softly while listening to the news over the phone. Harold, standing by her side, said only, "She can rest now." But the process was far from over. To turn the lab result into justice, the department needed to build a case strong enough for court, something that could survive decades of missing records and fading memories. Detective Hernandez began reconstructing Sabrina's last known hours minute by minute. He found old photographs from the convenience store, weather records, and dispatch logs. The blue pickup truck, once just a rumor, reappeared in an old insurance claim under Royce's name. Bit by bit, the fragments came together. By fall 2014, a warrant was issued for Calvin Royce's arrest. Louisiana marshals transported him back to Texas, where he was formally charged. News crews gathered outside the courthouse as residents of Marston County stood in stunned silence. The town that had carried Sabrina's memory for 21 years finally watched the man accused of taking her life walk through those courthouse doors in handcuffs. For the first time, after decades of waiting, it felt as though the truth had stepped into the light. The morning of the trial opened with the soft hum of news vans lined along the courthouse square. Reporters adjusted cameras while residents stood in quiet clusters, unsure whether to feel relief or disbelief. For many, the name Sabrina Miles had been part of their memories for so long that hearing it again, now beside the word trial, felt unreal. Inside the courtroom, light filtered through high windows and fell across wooden benches where families sat in patient silence. The Miles family occupied the front row. Diane clutched a folded photograph of her daughter, while Harold sat upright, his hands clasped together. Detective Lyle Hernandez, dressed in his dark suit, took his seat at the witness table. He had waited over 20 years for this day, not for recognition, but to see the story reach its rightful end. The defendant, Calvin Royce, was brought in quietly. He avoided the crowd's eyes as he took his place beside his attorney. His calmness, almost expressionless, contrasted with the emotion that filled the room. The prosecution began with the DNA evidence. The delicate strand of hair recovered from near the roadside in 1993. The forensic expert explained how the technology used decades ago could not test such a small sample, but that modern sequencing had finally unlocked the truth. Charts appeared on the courtroom screen, displaying genetic markers that matched Royce's profile with extraordinary precision. Every detail carried weight. When the prosecutor asked Detective Hernandez to describe the moment he received the match report, his voice trembled slightly. He said, "I read it 3 times to make sure. Then I looked at her picture. I knew this was the moment she had been waiting for." As he stepped down from the stand, the room was silent except for the faint click of a camera. Next came testimony from residents who remembered the old days of the search. Rita Vaughn, the retired gas station attendant, spoke softly but clearly. She recalled seeing Sabrina the day she disappeared and described the blue truck once more, her words aligning perfectly with records from Royce's employment history. Piece by piece, the puzzle reconstructed itself in front of the jury. When the defense argued that the DNA could have been transferred by accident, the prosecution reminded the court that no trace of Sabrina's belongings had ever been found anywhere else, only near that roadside, beside evidence consistent with Royce's work site. For Diane and Harold, listening was both healing and heavy. They had spent more than 2 decades not knowing, and now every fact returned like echoes of a moment they had long prayed to understand. During closing statements, the prosecutor turned toward the jury and said, "This is not a story about loss anymore. It is a story about light, about how time may be long but truth does not fade." The jury deliberated for several hours. The Miles family waited in the hallway, surrounded by friends and quiet voices offering comfort. When the bailiff finally opened the door and called everyone back, the air seemed to still. Diane reached for Harold's hand. The foreperson stood and spoke clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty." A quiet gasp spread through the room, followed by a long silence. Harold closed his eyes. Diane's hands trembled as she pressed the photograph of Sabrina against her chest. Detective Hernandez exhaled slowly, his eyes glistening but focused straight ahead. For him, this was not victory. It was fulfillment of a promise that began with a single strand of hair in a dusty evidence box. The judge thanked the jury for their service and addressed the Miles family directly. "This courtroom honors your strength. Justice has waited patiently, and today it stands with you." When the hearing concluded, the courthouse doors opened to sunlight. Reporters called out questions, but Diane spoke only once. She said, "We never stopped believing she would be found. Now she finally has peace." The months following the trial brought a quiet transformation to Marston County. The story that once divided the town now united it. Local schools began holding annual safety awareness events in Sabrina's memory. A small garden was planted behind the library, filled with white lilies and a plaque inscribed with her name and the words "Light always returns." Detective Hernandez attended the dedication ceremony, standing off to the side as families placed flowers around the memorial stone. He noticed how the children, some of whom were not even born when the case began, asked their parents about Sabrina. They learned her story not as tragedy, but as a lesson in perseverance and care. In private moments, Hernandez reflected on the long road that had led to this point. He remembered the early days of scanning old reports, the frustration of unanswered questions, the times when it seemed impossible to move forward. And yet, every small detail, every person who cared enough to remember, had helped bring the truth home. Years later, after retiring, he kept one framed photo in his study, a copy of the search poster from 1993. Beneath it, he wrote a single line: "Never let time silence what the heart remembers." For the Miles family, life slowly settled into quiet routines again. Harold tended to his garden each morning, and Diane volunteered at the local library where Sabrina once borrowed her favorite mystery novels. Some evenings, they walked to the memorial garden just before sunset. The flowers, always in bloom, carried the same soft scent that once filled their daughter's room. Neighbors often joined them, leaving handwritten notes on the stone, messages of love, gratitude, and memory. The story of Sabrina Miles began as a small-town mystery and ended as a symbol of endurance. In every courtroom transcript, in every photograph from the case, there remained a reminder of how persistence, faith, and science together can close the distance between loss and understanding. Years after the verdict, a documentary crew visited Marston County to film a segment on the evolution of forensic breakthroughs in Texas. When they interviewed Detective Hernandez, now gray-haired and gentle-spoken, he said something that stayed with every viewer who heard it. She was never forgotten. Time didn't win. People cared enough to keep her name alive, and that made all the difference. The documentary aired nationwide, and letters poured into the Miles family's mailbox. Messages from strangers who said her story gave them hope for their own unresolved journeys. Diane replied to each one personally, writing in neat cursive, "Thank you for remembering her. The world feels kinder when we don't forget. By 2025, more than 30 years after that night in 1993, the Miles family home still stood under the same pecan trees. The sound of the wind through the branches was soft, almost melodic. Inside the living room, Sabrina's phone rested beside a candle that had burned every November since her disappearance. That candle was no longer a symbol of waiting. It was one of gratitude. Because in the end, time had done what love always hoped it would. It carried truth across years, across silence, until it reached the hearts that never stopped listening.